Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, where we explore the historical reliability of the Bible. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, we welcome back archaeologist Abigail Van Huss to the program. Abigail will be our guide as we discuss the cursed mountain in the book of Joshua, called Mount Ebal. Abigail, welcome back to Digging for Truth. Good to have you on the show again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, for audience members who might have missed it the first time, Abigail was on our show before telling us about her journey in becoming an archaeologist. And if you're interested in becoming an archaeologist or a volunteer with ABR, we want to encourage you to watch that program. Okay, Abby, today we're going to, though, be talking about something more specific than our last show, and that is the cursed mountain, Mount Ebal. Tell us, give us a little intro to that, of where it's found in the Bible, why it's important, where it's located, and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. So just briefly, don't want to go into too much detail, but so in Deuteronomy 27:5, Moses is giving instructions, and he tells Joshua that when he goes into the land, he should go to Mount Ebal and build an altar there. And he gives him instructions for this whole ceremony that's going to happen there. And then, of course, in Joshua 8:30 is where we see that Joshua does that. And so the Israelites go to Mount Ebal. It's in the central hill country, kind of toward the north. And Shechem is the city. It sits in the valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, these two mountains on each side. And when the Israelites pronounce blessings and curses from these mountains, the blessings that will come to them if they obey God, and the curses that will befall them if they disobey. This is almost an inauguration ceremony. They're pledging their allegiance to God. They're making him the king of their newly founded country here in the land of Israel. And so this is super important. And then Joshua builds this altar on Mount Ebal, and they sacrifice to God. And so this is really the founding of the Israelite nation, the place where they make this covenant with God. And so biblically, as far as the Israelite people are concerned, this is a super important location for them.
Yes, very, very important. So you and I are going to focus today on the archaeology in kind of two major ways. The first one we want to talk about is the discovery of a structure on Mount Ebal by an archaeologist named Adam Zertal. And you've done extensive research on this. Your master's thesis was on this. So we're going to begin our journey there. Give us an intro to that, and let's start talking about the archaeology, because there's a lot of it and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, so a lot of the early explorers had gone looking for Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal. You know, they just explored the land of Israel looking for these biblical sites, and they never found what they were looking for. They were looking on the summit, some place that was visible from Mount Gerizim. They're like, this is logical, this is where it should be, and they didn't find it. And it wasn't until the 1980s, Adam Zertal was doing a survey of the region, just not looking for anything in particular, just looking for all the archaeological sites and documenting them. And he found this site on Mount Ebal, kind of on the backside. But it was this structure, this large stone structure, inside an enclosure, footprint-shaped enclosure. And he started excavating there. And what he found convinced him that this was Joshua's altar. And he hadn't even believed the biblical account. He didn't believe that Joshua had built an altar before this, but this changed his mind and convinced him that he had found Joshua's altar and that it did indeed exist.
All right. Well, let's explore some of that together. I guess the first thing that one would observe there is the enclosure that's around it. Tell us about the enclosure, what it looks like, and how similar it is to other ones that are found in Israel.
Yeah. So this was something that Adam Zertal began to notice as he was doing this survey, and he was looking at all of these sites across the region, is these footprint-shaped enclosures. So if you're looking at them from the top down, they're like the outline of a shoe or a sandal, a footprint. And he started noticing this multiple sites A lot of similarity between the sites. They were in a place that was kind of a natural amphitheater where you actually could go up on the hills and look down on it. And just the stone walls built in that shape. Um, some of them seem to have an altar in them. Um, and he believed that these were a central place of gathering for the Israelites. They weren't like people weren't living there, they weren't sheep pens, but they were a place where people could gather around um, and meet. And he believed that these were the Gilgalim. Um, in the Bible, you encounter the name Gilgal as a place, but it's not one particular place. It seems to move, or there's multiple. So in Hebrew, Gilgalim means Gilgals, plural. Um, and so Zertal believed that these were the Gilgalim, the places where the Israelites camped, where they gathered. This was a central place for them. And so I think there were at least 6 of these sites that he found um, altogether. So it may be as the Israelites moved around, as they were camping in different places, they were constructing these structures.
Yeah, it was really, really fascinating. The foot-shaped enclosure is a biblical text that seems to, put your foot in the land, kind of almost as if they were sort of symbolically sort of taking that promise of Yahweh and in imprinting it. So,
Exactly.
so the one that the foot-shaped enclosure on Ebal is one of many. So they're obviously interrelated. Let's just talk about the basics of what he found there, and then we'll dig into more in our next segment.
Yeah, so what he found was a central structure, a large rectangular structure. It had courtyards, it had a ramp leading up to it, and it had like a paved top. So it wasn't a house where he found walls sticking up with an inside. Instead, the walls came up and then there was a flat paved top. Um, and this structure was filled with ashes and bones. It he found that it was built over an earlier structure that was round, um, and it was a round structure that was kind of similar, and this one was also had ashes and bones inside of it.
Yeah. So how I remember reading in your book, and we're going to put up information about your book on this because you built it out of your master's thesis. The
Mhm.
orientation of the altar. Tell us about that. The way it's oriented.
Yeah, so what they found is rather than being like set straight to the compass, like, one side facing north, instead is set diagonally. So the corners faced toward the compass points. And that's something that might be indicative of a religious site. It seems like there might be some parallels at other sites where we see this. We don't know why, but it seems that they may have set religious structures, temples, altars, those kind of things, diagonally to the compass points rather than straight to them.
Excellent. Well, in our next segment, we're going to explore that further. Friends, thank you for watching Digging for Truth, and we'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with archaeologist Abigail Van Huss. We're talking about the cursed mountain, Mount Ebal. Okay, so Abby, Zertal found this structure which he deemed to be an altar. Inside of it, you mentioned there was ash and bones. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, so what kind of bones? What were they made up of? What did they look like? What's the profile of them? Tell us about the bones, because that's important.
Yeah, so Zertel found thousands of bones and bone fragments in this altar, and most of them were sheep and goats. There were some cows, and there were, oddly enough, wild deer, fallow deer that were native to that region. There were no pig bones, no unclean animal bones. So this is when we're looking at sites that are Israelite, we tend to see these cleaner bones, no pig bones because they weren't allowed to eat them, and this assemblage of bones was just pure clean animals, mostly sacrificial animals, and so Zertal believed that this was from sacrifices here at this site. Now, one thing that's odd to me when I'm looking at this is that these are inside the large structure. And Zertal believed that the large structure was Joshua's altar. He actually dated Joshua to a little bit later than I would, and I think a lot of ABR people would. And so when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at the earlier structure as Joshua's altar, and then the later one built afterwards, commemorating it, maybe continuing use of sacrifice there. But when we see that this larger structure has all these ashen bones inside it, that means that those ashen bones were created before the large altar was built, before it was in use. So those belong to the usage period of the earlier altar. And so we see that there was a lot of sacrificing going on at this earlier altar that may have only been in use for a short period of time, but it was very significant.
Yeah, according to the research in your book, 2,862 bones. That's a lot of bones, right?
A lot
of ash, and he did a really good job of analyzing this. Is the impression that I get from your research is that he was a good field archaeologist and did a good job with documenting all this.
He did, and he hired a team. He had an expert, a zoo archaeologist, analyze the bones. So yeah, very, very well done, very thoroughly researched.
Yeah, we do the same thing with our site at Shiloh because the sacrificial system, we have a zoo archaeologist who is on our staff. Okay, archaeology, there's always a lot of great things, architecture, bones, all kinds of different stuff, but pottery is really where it's at in the end in terms of dating. Let's talk pottery, Abby, because you've studied lots of pottery. This is where the rubber hits the road in archaeology. Tell us about what he found there and what you know about it.
So in Zertal's excavation, what he reported finding was that 97% of his pottery dated to the Iron Age 1. 3% dated to the Late Bronze Age. And so he dated this as an Iron Age 1 site. He believed that both phases, the earlier altar and the later altar, both dated to the Iron Age 1. He published the Late Bronze Age pottery, but he didn't really have an explanation for why that was there because there was no other use of this site before that period, or really after that period for a long, long time. And so, like, why was there a little bit of Late Bronze Age pottery? He didn't have an answer. Now, I think looking at that Late Bronze Age pottery, even though it's a small percentage, looking at the locations where it was found, I think that is the very first phase of occupation at the site. That's when that small, the original altar was built. That's when it was originally used. And I think that's what dates to the period of Joshua.
Yeah, and we should explain for maybe someone hearing the first time with pottery, you not only analyze the pottery that's found, but then you have to compare it to parallels from other sites. So you gotta show the money. You just can't make up the dates. You can't just make assumptions, right? You gotta really show that, and you show that in your book. You lay out that evidence of those parallels. So what I hear you saying is we're in pretty substantial agreement with Zertal with some disagreements about the phases. Am I describing that fairly?
Right. I would date the founding of the original altar to earlier than Zertal dated it to, based on his findings. But I do agree with him that it was in use in the Iron Age 1, and that was when it went out of use, and it wasn't used after that. So yeah, just a few little tweaks, a little bit of disagreement, but really looking at the same pieces, the same evidence, and just drawing something a little different out of it.
Out of the conclusion. So some of that is maybe someone watching for the first time. Tell us about maybe the most common pottery implements that we find, or specific ones there, however you want to describe it to someone. Like cooking pots, for example, is one of the most common things for obvious reasons. Tell us some about that, Abby.
Yeah. So yeah. Cooking pots, storage jars, jugs. At Mount Ebal, there's a really unique form of jug that we don't see hardly anywhere else. We have them at Shiloh. I actually just found one this season, which was fun. And it's a 3-handled thing. So you have the 2 handles, like you could pick up the jar, but then there's a 3rd handle on the spout so that you could pour. And so that one's, like I said, almost unique to Mount Ebal, but we do have a few at Shiloh. But cooking pots, that's something I really looked into because there's this progression of cooking pots that change over time. And so at Mount Ebal, we start with the very earliest, that's from the end of the late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age, and then we progress through the early Iron Age. And then it stops. And so from that progression of cooking pots, we can really see exactly when the site was in use. The same with storage jars. Special pieces like chalices. We have a few special painted imported wares, and those really help pin down dates because we can get really specific when we look at the collection as a whole and then compare the dates and try to figure out where these land.
The imported one, Abby, if you could give us a quick tutorial, if I remember right from your book, is Mycenaean pottery. So tell the audience what that is and how that helps us to get solid dates.
Yeah, so in the land of Canaan, of course, they had local potters making pottery, but there were also ships going back and forth to Cyprus, the Aegean, and so all of these ships would bring in pottery, and this was special stuff. This was painted. It was beautiful, unlike the local stuff, which was mostly just plain clay. And so if you were rich, you might have a piece of imported pottery, and so those pieces then we can compare with where they're from, the Mycenaean pottery, the Aegean pottery, and the Cypriot pottery, and so we can compare, and that the paint decorations change over time, and so that really helps us when we compare that with the local pottery that we have to pin down those dates.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back after this message.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm your host, Henry Smith. I'm here with archaeologist Abigail Van Huss. Abigail, we're talking about Mount Ebal, the cursed mountain. You've given us a description of the excavations that took place there in the 80s, but then ABR was involved in a project to look through the material that had been excavated. We want to make it clear, by the way, that we did not do excavations because that would have been illegal, but we were allowed to go through the previously excavated material. Tell us about the Mount Ebal wet sifting expedition.
Yeah, so like you said, we were able to take the dump piles from Zertal's excavation. We took them to a place, Shiloh, where we were able to go through them. So we dry sifted them to get out the excess dirt, and then we wet sifted them. And this was something that Zertal had not done on his original excavation. He had dry sifted, but he had not wet sifted. This is something that just wasn't done widespread during that time. And so when you do that, you wash the dirt off of all the little rocks and everything, and some of them turn out to not be rocks. They turn out to be something interesting. And so what we were finding, we were going through trash. We were going through what Zertal didn't keep. So we were finding little bits and pieces of things, little bits of pottery, little things. But we did find some interesting things, which I think made the project very much worth it. We found, for example, a lot of metal tools. We found flint blades. We found, a lot of pottery, which we were able to double check Zertal and see whether he was correct when he said that 97% of the pottery was Iron Age 1. We were able to double check that. And then, of course, our big find, which has been all over the news, was the lead curse tablet that we found there. I'm sure that you've talked about that already with other people, though.
Yes, yeah, that's a good survey. We'll talk about the tablet in a moment. I just want to backtrack to that pottery. Do I remember from your book, I didn't realize this, that about 10,000 pottery fragments you guys found that were overlooked. I know there was only 260 some that actually you could had diagnostic, but just tell us a little bit about that. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, we were very, very particular. And I wouldn't say that Zertal necessarily overlooked all of these shards. He didn't want them. It was too much for him, just the small chips of pottery
Got it.
that he didn't think were going to tell him anything. So it's not like he necessarily overlooked that. But yes, we did find important diagnostic pieces that he had overlooked because they were so small. And with those, we were able to look at them, assess them, and what we found really mostly agreed with Zertal. A large percentage, I don't remember the exact number, but a large percentage of our pottery was Iron Age 1. We did find a little bit more late Bronze Age pottery than he found. And that could partly be because when there was any question about whether it was Iron 1 or late Bronze Age, because the periods transition and some pieces could go either way, we pushed them to late Bronze Age because we wanted to double check those and keep those separate from what we knew was Iron Age 1. So our percentage of late Bronze Age was higher. Once we do the final assessment, some of that might go back to Iron Age 1. We found a very few Roman period shards, not enough to say that the site was occupied, but maybe somebody camped there and broke their cooking pot or something during the Roman period. But yes, the vast majority was Iron Age 1 with some late Bronze Age pottery, and that's what we were able to ascertain.
Very good. Thanks for correcting that, by the way. I wouldn't want to misrepresent what he did. He didn't overlook. Thank you for making that clear for our audience. So it helped, the evidence, the pottery, helped sort of evaluate the profile that he had already done. This is what we do in archaeology. We continue to go back to previous reports. We get new material. We compare, we contrast, we look at other sites, right? Other sites have been excavated since then. Let's talk about the curse tablet a little bit. You were there. So tell us about, like, I've heard the story from Dr. Stripling's perspective, but what was your perspective when this started unfolding?
So Frankie Snyder was the one who found it, and of course she knew lead as soon as she picked it up by the weight. And she showed it to me, and I had done some research on curse tablets. I actually, when we published the Khirbet el Maqader findings, I published the 3 tablets that we found there. None of them had curses written on them, but they were that type of tablet. And so, like, when I saw it, I knew what it was. I knew this is a lead curse tablet. I've seen these before. I've researched them before. Dr. Stripling was there. He knew what it was. And when we saw it, we thought, oh, this must be from the Roman period, the Greco-Roman period, somewhere in that horizon, because that's when most of those date to. It didn't cross our minds, or maybe if it crossed our minds, it was wishful thinking that it could date to the time of Joshua. But like, at least me, I thought, no, surely this is from a later period. Maybe somebody remembered that this was the mountain of the curse and they went back there and took this tablet, something like that. At that point, there was just no way of knowing that we would actually be able to scan the lead, see inside it, see the text in there, and all those developments came later. But we knew it was an exciting find. Originally, just not how exciting it was going to be.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so we got about a minute left. Just to tell our audience just a summary of why you think this site is important and its relationship to the Bible, Abby.
So I think the main importance of this is that this is the first site where we see the Israelites really coming together and gathering once they cross into the land of Israel. So for us as archaeologists especially, this is going to be the very earliest Israelite presence in the land that we can find archaeologically, other than the campsites that don't leave a lot of evidence. And so for us as archaeologists, this is important. Biblically speaking, it's a super important site where God made a covenant with mankind, and this is just part of the bigger picture of how God interacts with us as humans, and part of his plan leading up eventually to the New Testament, to Jesus, to salvation. And so this is just part of that big picture, but archaeologically speaking, a super important piece of the puzzle.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, Abby, and sharing your experience and your expertise on this. We want to encourage people to pick up a copy of your book, and we'll make that information available. Continued success with your studies. Soon to be Dr. Van Huss. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Friends, thank you for watching Digging for Truth. We hope you enjoyed this program today. Pray for us as we continue to investigate the information we found from Mount Ebal and continue to publish on this important subject. We hope you've been encouraged that you can trust the Bible.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.